What would you do if you were ripped from everything you knew and thrown into a world where your greatest strength became your deadliest weakness? Imagine being the most feared warrior in the underworld, a creature of pure muscle and violence, only to wake up in a place where magic rules and brute force marks you for death. This is the story of a barbarian who was never meant to exist in the world of mages, yet through a failed experiment by a nervous student, found himself trapped in the most dangerous place imaginable for someone like him, a prestigious magic academy. But here is where things get truly insane. To survive, he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to destroy the very thing that made him powerful. He would have to surgically remove his own muscles just to look weak enough to blend in. And from the shadows of the academy's forgotten sewers, he would begin a quiet conquest that no one saw coming. This is a story about transformation in its most brutal form, about sacrifice that goes beyond anything physical, about a monster who became more human than the humans who would have destroyed him. So settle in, because this journey is going to take us places you never expected. Let me tell you about Kale Thornvein. In the underworld, names carry weight. They carry fear. They carry the accumulated trauma of everyone who has ever heard them spoken in anger. And his name was spoken in whispers even among demons. Standing at nearly 7 feet tall, with arms thicker than most men's torsos, Kyle was what the underworld called a Ravager. This was not a title given lightly. The Ravager class represented the pinnacle of physical evolution in the lower planes. Centuries of selective pressure, of constant warfare, of brutal natural selection had produced these walking catastrophes. They were bred for one purpose and one purpose only: destruction. Kale's skin was marked with ritual scars from 100 battles won. Each mark told a story. The jagged line across his left shoulder was from the Night of Red Waters, when he had single-handedly held a bridge against an army of lesser demons for 3 days straight. The circular burns on his chest were from his initiation into the Ravager caste, when he had been forced to embrace molten iron as proof of his pain tolerance. The countless smaller marks scattered across his body were simply the accumulated evidence of 3 centuries of violence. His eyes burned with a dull crimson that could make lesser creatures lose control of their bowels. This was not metaphor. The crimson glow was a side effect of the demonic energy that saturated every cell of his being. It pulsed brighter when he was angry, dimmer when he was calm. Those who knew him well could read his mood in the intensity of that glow. Most who saw it, however, never had time to learn its patterns before they died. He had spent 300 years in the pits of the underworld, climbing the ranks through blood and broken bones. The underworld was organized into layers, each one more dangerous than the last. At the bottom were the spawning pits, where new demons emerged, confused and hungry. Above that were the fighting rings, where young demons proved their worth through constant combat. Higher still were the territories of the demon lords, where politics and power games played out across landscapes of fire and shadow. And at the very top, in the citadels that floated above the chaos, sat the demon princes who ruled it all. Kyle had clawed his way from the spawning pits to the right hand of one of those princes. 300 years of unbroken violence had earned him a seat at the table of power. He was respected. He was feared. He was, by any underworld measure, a success. Life, if you could call it that, was simple in the lower planes. Fight, kill, survive, repeat. There was no magic in the underworld, not the kind humans used anyway. The demons had their own power, drawn from the realm itself. But it was raw and unrefined. It could heal wounds and enhance strength, but it could not create or transform in the ways that human magic could. Everything in the underworld was physical, raw, primal. If you wanted something, you took it with your hands. If someone challenged you, you crushed them with your fists. If someone betrayed you, you made an example of them that would be remembered for centuries. Kale had never once considered that there might be a world where such strength was meaningless. A world where a scrawny child could level a mountain with a few whispered words. A world where the biggest muscles in existence would mark you as a target rather than a predator. He had no framework for understanding such a place, no preparation for what was coming. Miles above the underworld, separated by barriers of reality that were never meant to be crossed, the mortal realm spun beneath an unfamiliar sun. This realm was different in every conceivable way. The air was clean instead of thick with ash and sulfur. The sky was blue instead of eternally red. Living things grew here, green and vibrant, rather than the twisted fungi and carnivorous vegetation of the lower plains. And in this realm, humanity had built something that would have seemed impossible to any underworld creature. They had built civilization. Cities rose where once there had been wilderness. Roads connected distant lands, ships crossed vast oceans, and at the center of it all, acting as the engine of human progress, was magic. The Celestine Academy of Arcane Sciences stood as humanity's crowning achievement in the magical arts. For 5 centuries, it had produced the greatest mages the world had ever known. Archmaguses who could bend reality to their will, reshaping the world with a thought. Enchanters who could make steel weep and stone sing, creating artifacts of terrible beauty. Necromancers who danced with death itself, pulling secrets from beyond the grave. Elementalists who commanded the fundamental forces of nature. Diviners who could see through time and space. Transmuters who could turn lead into gold and dust into diamonds. Every discipline of magic was represented here, studied here, perfected here. The academy was not just a school. It was the heart of magical civilization. The academy's towers stretched toward the clouds, each one dedicated to a different school of magic. The Tower of Fire blazed with eternal flames that provided warmth and light for the entire campus. The Tower of Frost stood encased in perpetual ice, its interior a carefully maintained Arctic environment for specific magical research. The Tower of Life was covered in climbing vines and flowering plants that bloomed year-round, regardless of season. The Tower of Death, by contrast, was a stark black spire where no living thing could grow. Its stones saturated with necromantic energy accumulated over centuries. Smaller towers housed the administrative offices, the libraries, the dormitories, the practice halls. The whole complex covered an area larger than most cities, a small nation unto itself with its own laws, its own customs, its own hierarchy. At its center stood the Grand Spire, where the Council of 12 governed with absolute authority. These were the most powerful mages in the realm, each one a master of their respective discipline, each one old enough to have watched civilizations rise and fall. They answered to no king, no emperor, no worldly authority. The academy was sovereign, and they were its rulers. Their decisions shaped not just the institution, but the magical world as a whole. New spells were approved or forbidden based on their judgment. Dangerous research was permitted or prohibited at their discretion. The very definition of what magic was and was not allowed to do flowed from their chamber. Students came from noble families across the realm, each one hoping to unlock the secrets of the arcane. Admission to the academy was the greatest honor a young person could achieve, a guarantee of power and prestige that would last a lifetime. Those who graduated became the architects of nations. Court mages who advised kings, battle mages who commanded armies, researcher mages who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The hierarchy within the academy was rigid and absolute. Students were ranked by ability, and these rankings determined everything from dormitory assignments to class schedules to social standing. The highest-ranked students lived in luxury, while the lowest scraped by in cramped quarters at the edge of campus. They wore pristine robes of white and silver, color-coded with trim that indicated their specialty and rank. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about formulas and incantations, treating magical theory with the seriousness that scholars brought to philosophy. They believed themselves superior to the common folk who worked with their hands, the peasants who tilled fields and built walls through simple physical labor. After all, why would anyone need muscles when you could move mountains with your mind? Physical strength was considered almost embarrassing in this world, a sign of magical inadequacy. The most powerful mages were often thin, even frail, their bodies atrophied from years of mental focus rather than physical activity. Among these students was a young man named Elric Voss. He was 17 years old, thin as a reed, with perpetually trembling hands and thick spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. His robes were always slightly rumpled, his hair always slightly disheveled, his expression always slightly worried about something. Unlike his classmates who came from prestigious lineages stretching back generations, Elric was the son of a minor merchant who sold spices in a port city 300 miles away. His family had no magical tradition, no connections, no wealth beyond what his father had accumulated through years of careful trading. His admission to the academy was nothing short of a miracle, granted only because a traveling mage had noticed an unusual affinity for dark magic in the boy. It had happened by accident, really. The mage had been passing through the port city when Elric, then just 12 years old, had accidentally animated the skeleton of a fish his father was cleaning for dinner. The fish had flopped across the counter, confused by its new undead state, scattering scales everywhere before collapsing into a pile of bones. The mage had seen potential in that accident. Necromantic potential. An affinity for the manipulation of death energy that was rare and valuable. Necromancy, to be specific, was a respected but feared discipline within the academy. It required precision, control, and above all, caution. Those who practiced it walked a fine line between acceptable magic and forbidden territory. The manipulation of death energy could heal as easily as it could harm. It could commune with the departed, gaining knowledge lost to time. It could bind spirits to service, creating allies from the ranks of the dead. But it could also corrupt, twisting the practitioner into something less than human. The academy monitored its necromancy students carefully, watching for signs of darkness taking root. Elric had none of the qualities that made for a good necromancer. He was nervous where the discipline required calm. He was impulsive where it required patience. He was ambitious where it required humility. But he was determined, driven by a desperate need to prove that his presence at the academy was not a mistake, that he, the merchant's son, could stand alongside the noble children and hold his own. That desperation would prove to be catastrophic. The night of the accident was unremarkable by most standards. A heavy fog had rolled in from the eastern mountains, obscuring the academy grounds in a blanket of gray. The towers were barely visible through the mist, their magical lights reduced to dim glows in the darkness. Most students had retired to their dormitories, driven inside by the chill and the poor visibility. The common areas were empty. The libraries had closed early. Even the ever-present patrols of faculty members had been reduced, their surveillance impaired by the weather. But Elric had not retired. He had snuck into one of the abandoned practice chambers in the basement level, moving through corridors he had memorized weeks ago specifically for this purpose. The basement level was old, largely forgotten, used mainly for storage now. Most of the practice chambers had been sealed years ago after accidents and experiments gone wrong. But Elric had found one that was merely locked rather than magically sealed. He had spent 3 weeks working on that lock, finally managing to pick it open with trembling fingers and a hairpin borrowed from a female classmate. The chamber was old, unused for decades, its walls still bearing the scorched marks of experiments gone wrong. Perfect for what he had planned. The stone floor was cracked and uneven. The ceiling was low, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere that pressed down on Elric's nerves. In the corner, a pile of collapsed rubble marked where a section of the wall had given way at some point in the past. The air was stale, heavy with dust that rose in clouds with every step. But the summoning circle he had copied from the forbidden text required exactly this kind of abandoned, unsupervised space. He had spent weeks preparing. The summoning circle was drawn with grave dust mixed with his own blood, a paste that clung to the stone floor with supernatural adhesion. The formula was precise, requiring exact measurements and perfect geometric shapes. He had practiced drawing it a dozen times on paper before attempting it for real. The result was a complex pattern of overlapping circles and symbols, each one representing a different aspect of the summoning. 36 candles of black wax surrounded the perimeter, positioned at intervals determined by lunar charts and astronomical calculations. At each cardinal point, he had placed an offering: a raven's feather for air, representing the breath that would animate his summoned creature; a serpent's scale for water, representing the flowing essence of life and death; volcanic ash for fire, representing the energy that would fuel the connection; a clump of cemetery soil for earth, representing the grave from which spirits emerged. According to the text, this ritual would summon a minor shade from the realm of the dead, a simple spirit that he could bind to his will and use to boost his necromantic abilities. The text had described these shades as wispy, barely coherent things, useful for practice but ultimately harmless. It was supposed to be easy, a stepping stone to greater power, a way to prove his worth to the professors who doubted him. Elric did not know that the text he had copied from was incomplete, that crucial sections had been deliberately removed by the Academy's archivists centuries ago, that the summoning circle he had drawn was fundamentally flawed in ways he could not possibly understand. Elric began the incantation, his voice cracking with nervousness as the words left his lips. The language was old arcane, a dead tongue used only in magical rituals, and his pronunciation was terrible. But the power came not from the words themselves, but from the intent behind them. And Elric's intent was clear, focused by months of frustration and desperation. The candles flickered, their flames bending toward the center of the circle, as if drawn by an invisible force. So far, so good. The grave dust began to glow with a sickly green light, pulsing in rhythm with his chanting. Excellent. Everything was happening exactly as the text had described. He continued, his confidence growing with each verse. The air in the chamber grew cold, dropping from comfortable to chill to genuinely uncomfortable in the span of seconds. His breath came out in visible puffs, crystallizing in the frigid air. The shadows on the walls began to writhe and dance, moving independently of the candle flames, taking on shapes that might have been faces if he looked too closely. This was it. This was working. He was doing it. He was actually summoning a spirit from beyond the veil of death. Then everything went wrong. A single drop of sweat fell from Elric's forehead, squeezed out by concentration and nervousness. It fell in an arc that seemed to take forever, tumbling through the cold air toward the floor, and it landed on the outer edge of the circle. Such a small thing. So insignificant. A single drop of living moisture touching the boundary of the summoning circle. But in the precise world of summoning magic, such contamination was catastrophic. The circle's geometry was designed to create a stable connection between realms, a controlled pathway through which a specific type of entity could be drawn. Elric's sweat introduced a new variable into an equation that could not tolerate variables. Living essence touched dead design. The balance shattered. The circle destabilized instantly. The carefully balanced energies that had been building in controlled patterns suddenly found themselves without direction. They spiraled out of control, building on each other in a feedback loop of increasing chaos. The green glow of the grave dust shifted to purple, then red, then colors that had no names in any human language. The candles exploded simultaneously, their black wax spattering the walls in patterns that would later give investigators nightmares. The temperature in the chamber dropped so fast that ice crystals formed in the air itself. Instead of reaching into the realm of the dead as intended, The ritual punched through dimensional barriers like a fist through paper. It tore through the membrane separating the mortal realm from the underworld itself. Not the neat, controlled realm of human dead, but the true underworld where demons dwelt. The connection lasted only a fraction of a second, but in dimensional terms, a fraction of a second was an eternity. And on the other side of that connection, in a chamber of black stone deep within a demon prince's citadel, Kale Thornvane was in the middle of crushing a rival's skull when he felt something seize him. He had been engaged in a formal combat, a dispute over territory that could only be settled through blood. His opponent was large, almost as large as himself, a fellow ravager who had challenged his position in the court. Kale had been winning decisively, his superior experience showing in every exchange. He had the rival's head in his hands, ready to deliver the killing blow when the sensation hit. It was as if a giant hand had reached into his chest and pulled. Not physically. His physical body remained where it was, still holding his opponent. But something deeper, something essential, was being yanked away with irresistible force. His essence, his soul, if such a thing existed in the underworld. His very being was being dragged through dimensions, compressed and stretched and torn apart, and reassembled in the span of a single agonizing heartbeat. Colors he had no names for exploded across his vision. Sounds that should not exist screamed in his ears. He experienced sensations that 300 years of existence had not prepared him for. Cold that burned, heat that froze, light that was darkness and darkness that was light. Every reference point he had ever relied upon was stripped away, leaving only chaos and confusion. For the first time in his long life, Kale Thornvane felt genuine fear. Not the cautious wariness he brought to every battle, but real, primal terror at forces beyond his comprehension. Then there was light. Blinding, burning light that seared his eyes after centuries in the darkness of the underworld. He crashed into existence in the practice chamber with enough force to crack the stone floor beneath him. The impact should have killed anything human. It merely stunned him, his underworld physiology absorbing damage that would have liquefied ordinary flesh. The summoning circle shattered beneath his body, its pattern disrupted beyond any hope of repair. The remaining candle stubs that had not exploded flew across the chamber, clattering against the walls. Elric was thrown against the far wall by the shockwave, unconscious before he hit the ground. Kyle lay there for a long moment, struggling to understand what had happened. Every sense was overwhelmed. The air here was different. Thinner. Cleaner. It burned in his lungs like acid after the thick, sulphurous atmosphere of the underworld. His chest heaved as he tried to process oxygen in concentrations his body had never experienced. The light from the broken candles hurt his eyes, even though it was dim compared to what he would later learn was sunlight. His skin felt strange, exposed to air that was not saturated with demonic energy. The smells were wrong. No sulfur, no blood, no burning. Instead, dust and stone and something else, something organic that he could not identify. The textures were wrong. The stone beneath him was smoother, more refined than underworld rock. Even gravity felt slightly different, as if the world itself was rejecting his presence. Everything was off. Everything was alien. He forced himself to his feet, his massive frame cracking the stone further as he moved. His body was intact, which was something. He looked down at his hands, at the familiar scars and calluses that covered them, and felt a small measure of relief. Whatever had happened, he was still himself. Whatever this place was, he had not been destroyed in the transition. Then he heard footsteps approaching, voices calling out in a language he did not recognize. The words were musical, flowing, completely different from the guttural tongue of the underworld. They carried tones of alarm, concern, urgency, and instinct, honed over 300 years of survival, screamed at him to hide. He did not know where he was. He did not know who was coming. but he knew that revealing himself before he understood the situation was a guaranteed path to disaster. Kale moved faster than something his size should be able to, diving behind a pile of collapsed rubble just as the chamber door burst open. Light flooded in, carried by floating orbs that hovered around a group of figures in flowing robes. The orbs moved independently, drifting through the air with apparent intelligence, illuminating every corner of the chamber. The figures themselves were thin, pale, wrong in ways that made Kale's instincts howl. They radiated energy in ways that made his skin crawl. Not the raw, brutal power of the underworld that he could understand and counter. Something different. Something that felt fundamentally opposed to everything he was. Mages. He did not know the word yet, but he recognized power when he saw it. These beings could hurt him, maybe even kill him. And they were examining the chamber with growing alarm, their voices rising in pitch as they took in the destruction. Kale pressed himself against the rubble, willing himself to be invisible, barely breathing as the floating light orbs drifted within feet of his hiding place. The mages rushed to the unconscious student, checking his condition with glowing hands that made Kyle's stomach turn. The glow was similar to healing magic in the underworld, but cleaner somehow. Purer. They spoke rapidly in that strange language, their tones urgent and alarmed. One of them, an older man with a long gray beard that reached nearly to his waist, examined the destroyed summoning circle with growing horror. He traced the broken lines with his fingers, muttering under his breath. Then he said something that made the others pale. They looked at each other with expressions of barely controlled panic. Whatever had happened here, they understood its significance far better than the Barbarian, hiding in the shadows. They knew something had gone terribly wrong. They knew something had come through that should not have. They just did not know that it was watching them from less than 10 feet away. Kale watched as they carried the unconscious student away, moving with urgent purpose. One of them remained behind for a moment, casting some kind of spell that washed over the chamber in a wave of blue light. Searching, scanning. Kale held perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. The light passed over his hiding spot and moved on. He was not detected. Perhaps underworld creatures did not register on whatever magical senses they possessed. Perhaps his hiding spot was simply good enough. Either way, the mage eventually left, sealing the door behind him with a gesture that made the stone itself flow together. Kale waited in silence for what felt like hours, barely breathing, listening to the fading footsteps and distant voices. Only when he was absolutely certain they were gone did he emerge from hiding. The chamber was dark now, the light orbs having departed with the mages. But his crimson eyes could see in darkness far deeper than this. He began to explore, examining the destroyed summoning circle, the blood and grave dust and candle wax scattered across the floor. He picked up the unconscious student's abandoned spectacles and turned them over in his massive hands, trying to understand what had happened. Someone had brought him here. That much was clear. This chamber, this ritual had been responsible for ripping him from the underworld. But who? Why? And most importantly, where exactly was he? The answers would come, but only through patience and observation. Patience that went against every instinct he possessed. Observation that required caution rather than action. Kyle set the spectacles down and moved toward the sealed door. He could feel the magic that held it closed, a barrier that would require force to breach. Force that would announce his presence to everyone in this place. Instead, he began to search for other exits. Air vents, drainage channels, cracks in the ancient stonework. There was always a way out. There was always a path forward. He just had to find it. The academy was a nightmare of confusing corridors and impossible architecture. Over the following hours, Kyle navigated this maze through instinct and growing frustration. Stairways led to nowhere, ending in blank walls that had no business being there. Rooms existed inside other rooms, spaces that defied physical laws, doors opened to places that should not exist, glimpses of void and starfield that made his head spin. This place was saturated with magic, its very structure shaped by centuries of arcane experimentation. Nothing followed logical rules. Nothing made sense by underworld standards. He avoided the floating light orbs that seemed to patrol the hallways, ducking into shadows and side passages whenever he detected their approach. He avoided the occasional student hurrying to some unknown destination, pressing himself against walls and holding his breath until they passed. He learned quickly that his appearance was a problem. The few students who caught glimpses of him reacted with screaming terror. One actually fainted dead away. Another conjured a ball of fire that Kale barely dodged, leaving a scorched mark on the wall where his head had been. He did not blame them for their fear. In this world of thin, pale magicians, he must have looked like a monster from their worst nightmares, which, he supposed, he was. Eventually, he found his way downward, always downward. The deeper levels of the academy were older, less maintained, more forgotten. The floating lights were fewer here, their patrols less frequent. The air grew damp and stale, carrying smells of mold and decay that were almost comforting after the sterile cleanliness above. And finally, after hours of cautious exploration, he discovered the sewers. Vast tunnels of ancient stonework that ran beneath the entire academy, carrying water and waste to some distant processing facility. They were old, far older than the academy itself, remnants of some civilization that had existed here before the mages came. The stonework was massive, blocks that must have weighed tons each, fitted together with precision that even underworld builders would respect. The tunnels stretched in every direction, a labyrinth beneath the labyrinth, forgotten by everyone above. It was dark down here. Not the absolute darkness of the underworld pits, but dark enough to hide. It was damp, moisture seeping through the ancient stone and collecting in puddles on the floor. It smelled of things he would rather not identify, sewage and rot and generations of accumulated filth. And for Kale it was perfect. Here, in this forgotten underworld beneath an underworld of magic, he could hide. He could think. He could plan. The first weeks were survival in its purest form. Kale had to relearn everything about existence. Food in this realm was different. The creatures here were smaller, faster, different in composition from the beasts of the underworld. He could not simply hunt and kill as he once had. The animals fled before he could catch them. The larger creatures were protected by magical barriers he could not break. Even the plants were strange, their textures and tastes alien to his palate. He subsisted on rats at first, catching them with his bare hands in the dark tunnels and eating them raw. The meat was thin and stringy, barely enough to sustain his massive form. But it was something. It was survival. It was degrading. A ravager of his status reduced to vermin. He who had feasted at the tables of demon princes was now choking down sewer rats in the darkness. Pride was a luxury he could not afford. Pride would not fill his belly. Pride would not keep him alive long enough to understand this world and find a way to survive in it. So he swallowed his pride, along with the rats, and he kept going. Water came from the streams that flowed through the sewers, filtered through his teeth to remove the worst of the debris. It tasted of stone and rust and things better left unexamined, but it kept him hydrated. Sleep was taken in short bursts, always with one eye open, always alert to the sounds of approaching footsteps. He found a chamber that had been sealed off, probably centuries ago, its entrance hidden behind a collapsed section of tunnel. This became his home, such as it was. A dark hole in a forgotten place, where the greatest warrior of the underworld curled up like a cornered animal and tried to understand what had happened to his life. He learned the rhythms of the academy above through vibrations in the stone. The thunder of thousands of feet during what he would later learn were class changes. The rumble of magical experiments, felt through layers of rock as distant tremors. the silence of night when most students slept. The academy growing quiet enough that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the walls. He began to venture out during these quiet hours, exploring the lower levels of the academy with careful precision. He found storage rooms filled with discarded equipment, magical devices that had been deemed obsolete or dangerous, gathering dust in forgotten corners. He found kitchens where leftover food was thrown into chutes that led down to the sewers, and he learned to wait beneath these chutes for the bounty they provided: bread, meat, vegetables, real food that made the rats seem like a distant nightmare. He found libraries whose bottom floors were so dusty and forgotten that no one had visited them in years. Their shelves lined with books that would eventually become his teachers. And in those libraries, he found the key to his survival. Kyle had never learned to read. In the underworld, literacy was meaningless. Strength was the only language that mattered. Communication was done through grunts, gestures, and violence. The idea of encoding information in symbols and preserving it on processed plant material was so foreign to him that it took weeks before he even understood what the books were for. But he was not stupid. 300 years of survival had made him cunning in ways that went beyond mere combat. He understood that these symbols meant something, that the knowledge contained in these pages might hold the key to his continued existence. So he began to teach himself, matching the strange symbols to the words he heard through the ceilings and walls above. It was painstakingly slow work. He would listen to conversations, pressing his ear against grates and cracks in the floors, memorizing phrases and their contexts. Then he would return to the libraries and search for those same phrases in the books, trying to match spoken sounds to written symbols. The first word he learned to read was light, written above a switch that controlled the library's illumination. The second was exit, written above a door. The third was warning, written above a chest that turned out to contain mild poison when opened. Months passed before he could make sense of basic sentences. Longer still before he could read with anything approaching fluency. But gradually, painfully, the language of this world began to make sense. Through books and careful observation, Kyle learned about the world he had been dragged into. He learned about magic, the force that defined this realm as completely as violence defined the underworld. There were different schools, different disciplines, each with their own techniques and hierarchies. Elemental magic controlled fire, water, earth, and air. Enchantment infused objects with magical properties. Necromancy manipulated the energies of death. Divination revealed the hidden and the future. Transmutation changed the fundamental nature of matter. Each school had its masters, its traditions, its rivalries. He learned about the academy itself, its 500-year history, its rules and politics, its place in the wider world. It was not just a school. It was a power unto itself, influencing nations and shaping the course of human civilization. The Council of 12 who ruled it were among the most powerful beings in the realm. Their decisions affected millions of lives. Wars had been started and stopped at their command. Kings bowed to their authority in matters of magic, and he learned, with growing horror, what happened to creatures like him in this realm. The mages called them demons, unholy beings from the lower planes, creatures to be studied, bound, or destroyed depending on the circumstances and the inclinations of the mage who encountered them. There was no place for a barbarian from the underworld in this society. He was not simply foreign. He was classified as an enemy of all humanity. If they found him, they would kill him. That was the best-case scenario. Worse, they might capture him. There were entire departments of the academy dedicated to the study of demonic beings. He had seen the jars in the restricted sections of the library, the specimens preserved in magical solutions, dissected, labeled, studied. Parts of creatures not so different from himself, floating in eternal preservation, their suffering frozen for eternity. He would not become one of those specimens. He would die fighting first. But he would prefer not to die at all. but hiding forever was not an option either. The sewers were not sustainable as a long-term home. The food from the kitchen chutes was inconsistent, sometimes plentiful and sometimes absent for days. The rats were insufficient for a body that required enormous quantities of protein to maintain its mass. And the winters in this realm were harsh, colder than anything the underworld had prepared him for. Even his demonic constitution struggled against the frigid temperatures that settled into the tunnels during the cold months. His breath would crystallize, his muscles would stiffen. Without proper shelter and warmth, he would eventually weaken and die. And the loneliness was maddening. For a creature who had spent 300 years surrounded by violence and chaos, the silence was its own form of torture. In the underworld, there was always something happening. Combat, politics, drama. Here there was only the drip of water and the scurry of rats, and his own thoughts echoing endlessly in the darkness. He found himself talking to himself just to hear a voice, arguing with imaginary opponents, reliving old battles in his mind to remind himself of who he was. He needed a plan, a way to exist in this world without being discovered, a way to be something other than a monster hiding in the sewers. And as he read more, as he observed more, as he understood more about how this world worked, an idea began to form. An idea so desperate, so insane, that he laughed when it first occurred to him. The sound echoed through the tunnels, startling the rats into flight. He would become a mage. The absurdity of it was almost too much to process. Kale Thornvein, ravager of the underworld, crusher of armies, right hand of demon Prince Malachar, pretending to be a scrawny human student who could barely lift a sword. The very thought should have been insulting, should have been impossible, should have been abandoned immediately. But the more he thought about it, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. Students came and went at the academy in regular cycles. New faces appeared every year, fresh arrivals from across the realm. The population was in constant flux, people coming and going, transferring between institutions, dropping out, joining late. No one knew everyone. No one could possibly track every student in an institution of this size. If he could somehow pass as human, if he could somehow blend in with the thousands of young mages studying here, he might be able to survive in plain sight. The advantages were enormous. He would have access to food, shelter, warmth. He could move freely through the academy rather than skulking through the sewers. He could learn magic properly, understanding the forces that ruled this world rather than simply hiding from them. He might even find a way home eventually, though that hope was distant and uncertain. The question was how, and the answer, when it came to him after weeks of careful consideration, was absolutely horrifying. His body was the problem. Everything about him screamed underworld barbarian. His size, nearly 7 feet of towering muscle. His build, arms and legs like tree trunks, chest like a barrel. His scars, ritual marks that covered his skin in patterns no human would possess. His crimson eyes, still glowing faintly with demonic energy no matter how he tried to suppress it. No amount of disguise could hide what he was, as long as he looked like what he was. Robes could not conceal his frame. Makeup could not hide his features. Illusions might work, temporarily, but they could be detected and dispelled. But what if he did not look like that anymore? What if he could change his appearance so fundamentally that even his own kind would not recognize him? The idea took root in his mind and refused to let go, growing like a cancer, consuming his thoughts. He began to research transformation magic, spending countless hours in the dusty library stacks, reading by the light of stolen candles. Shape-shifting spells existed, powerful magic that could alter a body completely. But they required magical ability he did not possess. His underworld nature was fundamentally incompatible with the magic of this realm. The energies repelled each other like oil and water. He had tried to learn even the simplest spells and failed utterly. His body simply would not respond to the gestures and incantations. Illusions could alter appearance, making someone seem different than they actually were. But they were detectable by anyone with magical sensitivity, and an academy full of mages was essentially a city full of magical sensors. The illusion would be spotted within hours, probably minutes, and once spotted, he would be exposed. Nothing seemed to offer a permanent solution. Nothing magical anyway. Then he found the medical texts. The academy had a small but advanced healing faculty, mages who specialized in the magic of flesh and bone. Their abilities bordered on miraculous. They could regrow limbs lost to battle or accident. They could cure diseases that would kill ordinary people in minutes. They could repair damage that seemed irreparable, restoring shattered bodies to perfect function. And they could, with the right procedures, alter the physical structure of a body. The texts described treatments for patients with deformities, procedures that could reshape bone and redistribute tissue. Muscle could be removed or relocated. Bone structure could be adjusted. Features could be refined or altered. The procedures were intended for healing purposes, helping those born with defects or injured beyond normal recovery. But the principles were the same. With the right tools and knowledge, a body could be remade. Kale could remake himself. The decision to go through with it was not made lightly. For weeks, Kale wrestled with the implications. His strength was his identity. Everything he had been, everything he had achieved in the underworld, was built on his physical power. His muscles were earned through 300 years of brutal combat. Every scar told a story of survival against impossible odds. To give that up was to give up a part of himself that could never be recovered. He spent long nights in his hidden chamber, staring at his hands, watching the muscles shift beneath his scarred skin as he flexed and clenched. These hands had crushed skulls. These arms had torn enemies limb from limb. This body had survived everything the underworld had thrown at it for 3 centuries, and he was contemplating destroying it himself. The irony was not lost on him. All those enemies who had tried to bring him down, and in the end, he would do what they could not. But the alternative was death or eternal hiding. Neither was acceptable. He had not survived 3 centuries of underworld warfare just to waste away in a sewer beneath a school for children. If changing himself was the price of survival, he would pay it. He would hate it. He would mourn what he lost. But he would pay it. Because survival was the only victory that truly mattered. The procedure would require resources he did not have. Medical tools of specific design. Magical implements used by the healing faculty for their surgeries. Magical supplies, components, and compounds that enabled the transformative processes. Pain suppression agents, because even his inhuman tolerance had limits. And most importantly, knowledge. The healing texts described procedures in detail, but performing those procedures on himself would require understanding them completely. He spent months gathering what he needed, stealing from supply closets and abandoned laboratories, pilfering from storage rooms that had not been inventoried in decades. He studied the healing texts until he could recite the procedures from memory, visualizing each step, understanding the theory behind each technique. He practiced basic magical gestures, learning to channel the trace amounts of ambient energy that even he could manipulate. It was not true magic. It was barely anything at all. But it would have to be enough to activate the healing implements and guide the transformation process. He chose a night when the Academy was hosting a grand festival, celebrating some anniversary or accomplishment he did not care about. The noise from above would cover any sounds he made. The tunnels were emptier than usual, as even the rats seemed drawn to the warmth and excitement of celebration. Kyle prepared his workspace in the chamber he had claimed as his own, laying out the tools with surgical precision on a flat stone that served as his operating table. He had made the stone as clean as he could manage, scrubbing it with water from the sewers until it was merely dirty rather than filthy. It would have to do. The tools gleamed in the candlelight, cutting implements enchanted for precision. clamps designed to hold tissue in place, tubes for drainage, needles for suturing, and the most important piece, a healing wand that would close wounds as he made them, preventing fatal blood loss while allowing him to continue the procedure. He had stolen it from a faculty office 3 months ago, replacing it with a mundane replica that would not be noticed missing. He stripped off the scraps of clothing he had accumulated, standing naked in his hidden chamber for what he knew would be the last time. He looked at his body, really looked at it, memorizing every detail. The bulk of his shoulders, the definition of his arms, the scarred terrain of his torso. All of it was about to change. All of it was about to be cut away. Then he began. The first cut was the hardest, not physically. Physically, pain was nothing to him. His nervous system had been rewired by centuries of underworld existence to process pain as information rather than suffering. He could feel the blade opening his flesh, the warm flow of blood, the separation of tissue from tissue. But it did not hurt in the way it would hurt a human. What hurt was the meaning of it, the acceptance of what he was doing to himself. He cut into the muscle of his left arm first, removing a section of tissue that had taken decades to build. The flesh parted beneath the enchanted blade, blood welling up instantly. He activated the healing wand, directing its energy to close the wound behind his work, preventing him from bleeding out while keeping the surgical site open. The process was agonizing in its methodical nature. Cut, remove, heal, cut, remove, heal, layer after layer of muscle being stripped away. Hours passed as he worked on his own body with determination that bordered on madness, the chamber filled with the smell of blood and the soft glow of healing magic. His left arm was reduced first, the massive trunk becoming merely athletic, then thin, then almost normal. He moved to the right arm, repeating the process, trying to maintain symmetry that would look natural rather than surgically altered. His torso came next, the barrel chest that had absorbed blows that would kill lesser creatures. Tissue was removed, relocated, redistributed. His waist narrowed. His shoulders dropped. His silhouette transformed from overwhelming to ordinary. Each cut was precise, guided by months of study and memorization. Each wound was closed immediately after, leaving no trace of the surgery beyond the fundamental change in his shape. His legs were the most difficult, requiring him to work in positions that tested even his underworld flexibility. But he managed, reducing the tree trunk limbs to something that could pass for human. His height was harder to address. He could not simply cut himself shorter. Instead, he had to compress his spine, adjust his skeletal structure, change his posture. The healing wand worked overtime, reshaping bone that should not bend, forcing his body into a configuration it had never known. By morning, the creature that remained bore little resemblance to the ravager who had entered the chamber. Kyle had reduced his height by nearly a foot through a combination of tissue removal and skeletal compression. His arms, once thick enough to encircle trees, were now merely athletic. His barrel chest had flattened to something almost normal. Even his face had been altered. The harsh angles softened through careful tissue manipulation. The crimson eyes dimmed to a dull brown through a magical tincture he had found in the healing supplies. He looked human, weak, ordinary. Looking at himself in a shard of mirror he had salvaged from the trash heaps, Kyle felt a strange mixture of grief and triumph. The barbarian was dead. Long live whoever this new person was going to be. The transformation was only the beginning. Looking human was one thing. Acting human was something else entirely. Kale had spent centuries communicating through grunts, roars, and violence. Subtlety was not a concept that existed in the underworld. You said what you meant. You did what you said. Complex social interactions were resolved through combat, not conversation. The nuances of human social interaction were completely foreign to him. He had to learn how to walk like them, taking smaller steps instead of the predatory strides that came naturally, keeping his center of gravity high rather than low and ready for combat. He had to learn how to speak like them, softening his voice from a battlefield roar to something conversational, modulating his tone to express emotions he barely understood. He had to learn how to think like them, suppressing the constant aggressive impulses that had kept him alive in the underworld, approaching situations with patience rather than immediate action. He practiced endlessly in his sewer chamber, speaking to imaginary classmates, mimicking the body language he observed through grates and cracks in the floors above. He learned their greetings, the casual phrases exchanged between acquaintances. "Good morning. How are you? Lovely weather. Nice to meet you." Phrases that meant nothing and everything, social lubricant that kept interactions smooth. He discovered that humans placed enormous importance on things that seemed trivial to him. Clothing, for instance. The cut of a robe could indicate rank, family, specialty, and financial status. A mage wearing crimson trim was studying elemental fire. A mage wearing black trim was studying necromancy. Gold buttons indicated noble birth. Silver indicated common. The permutations were endless, a complex code that everyone seemed to understand instinctively. Eye contact had meaning. Direct eye contact was either confident or aggressive, depending on context. Avoiding eye contact was either respectful or suspicious, again depending on context. The way you held your hands while speaking conveyed information. Clasped hands indicated formality. Gesturing hands indicated enthusiasm. Hidden hands indicated something to hide. It was exhausting, learning to communicate in a language he could not read through body alone. The hardest part was suppressing his strength. Even diminished, his underworld physiology gave him power that far exceeded normal humans. The surgery had removed muscle, but it had not changed the fundamental nature of his flesh. His reduced arms were still stronger than human arms several times their size. A casual gesture could shatter bone. A careless handshake could crush fingers. A moment of forgotten control could expose him instantly. He had to learn to control every movement with absolute precision, treating every interaction as a potential disaster waiting to happen. He practiced on rats, learning to handle them without killing them, adjusting his grip until it was gentle enough not to squeeze the life from them. He practiced on stones, learning to grip without crushing, to hold without breaking. He practiced on himself, learning the limits of his new, lesser form, understanding how much force it could appear to exert without revealing its true capabilities. After 6 months of preparation, physical and social and psychological, Kale decided he was ready. The Academy's spring admissions were approaching, and he had forged the necessary documents using samples stolen from administrative offices. His new identity was Kalen Vert, a minor noble from a distant territory that had recently fallen to plague. The plague explained why he had no verifiable history, why no one from his homeland could be contacted to verify his story. The distance explained why no one would recognize him, why his accent might seem slightly off, why his customs might seem slightly different. It was a thin cover, paper held together with hope, but it would have to be enough. On the morning of the admissions examination, Kale emerged from the sewers for the first time in almost a year. The sunlight no longer burned his eyes, his time in the upper sewers and libraries having gradually accustomed him to brightness. His clothes, stolen from student donations and altered to fit his reduced frame, were clean and presentable. He walked among the other applicants with his head down and his hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of nervous nobility facing an uncertain future. The examination hall was vast, a great dome supported by columns of living crystal that pulsed with magical energy. Hundreds of prospective students filled the space, accompanied by their families, their servants, their endless entourages of privilege. Kyle had no family, of course, no one to see him off, no one to wish him luck. He stood alone at the edge of the crowd, watching the noble children embrace their parents, receive last-minute advice, accept talismans and tokens of good fortune. But he did not need luck. He had survived things that would drive these children mad. He had killed creatures that would make their professors weep. He had transformed himself through surgery and willpower into something new. A simple entrance examination was nothing compared to what he had already endured. The written portion was laughably easy. Months of obsessive study had given him knowledge that exceeded most applicants, who had been too busy enjoying their privileged lives to truly apply themselves to learning. He answered questions about magical theory, about history, about the structure of the arcane world, with confidence that surprised even himself. The practical portion was more challenging. He had to demonstrate magical ability without revealing that his magic was barely a spark compared to their flames. He chose necromancy as his specialty, the same discipline that had brought him to this world. It seemed fitting, and his affinity for death energy, while weak by mage standards, was still stronger than his virtually non-existent affinity for other schools. His demonstration was simple, a basic animation of dead matter. He had practiced it thousands of times in the sewers, raising rat skeletons and collapsing them again, learning the precise amount of effort required to achieve the effect without revealing his underworld nature. The examiners watched with bored expressions as he made a small pile of bones twitch and shuffle across the floor. They noted his results on their clipboards and waved him on. Unimpressed. Exactly what he wanted. He was admitted as a lower-ranked student, given accommodation in the Eastern dormitory with other students of modest ability. The room was small, shared with another low-ranked student, but it was warm and dry and had a bed with actual blankets. After a year in the sewers, it felt like a palace. The first weeks at the academy were a strange form of torture. Kyle had to sit in classrooms, pretending to struggle with lessons he had already mastered in the sewers. The professors droned on about basic magical theory, and he had to fake confusion at concepts he understood thoroughly. He had to raise his hand with wrong answers, had to ask unnecessary questions, had to maintain the illusion of mediocrity that was his best defense. He had to share meals with children who complained about their privileged lives. They moaned about the quality of the food that was better than anything he had eaten in the underworld. They complained about their demanding parents who loved them enough to demand anything at all. They whined about difficult assignments that took hours rather than the years of combat training required in the underworld. He had to participate in social events where the greatest danger was embarrassment rather than death. Dances where the most aggressive action was asking someone to partner. Debates where the fiercest weapon was rhetoric. Games where the worst outcome was losing points rather than losing limbs. Everything about it was alien and frustrating. But he adapted. He always adapted. He made careful alliances with other low-ranked students, those who were similarly overlooked and underestimated by the academy's rigid hierarchy. A girl named Mira, who came from a farming family and struggled with the theoretical aspects of magic. A boy named Tam, who had been admitted on scholarship and faced constant discrimination for his poverty. A quiet young woman named Sarah, who seemed to carry some secret burden that kept her isolated from her peers. They formed a quiet community of underdogs, supporting each other through the academy's harsh hierarchy. And he watched. He observed the power structures, the political dynamics, the hidden conflicts beneath the surface of academic life. The academy was not the peaceful institution it appeared to be. Factions competed for influence, aligning themselves with different schools of magic, different philosophical approaches, different visions of how the magical world should operate. Professors had agendas, pursuing personal research goals, cultivating favorite students, engaging in petty rivalries that sometimes turned serious. Students with powerful families dominated those without, using their connections to secure advantages, to escape consequences, to shape the institution to their benefit. It was not so different from the underworld, really. Just quieter, more subtle, and infinitely more hypocritical. In the underworld, at least, violence was honest. Here, the violence was hidden behind smiles and courteous words. Kale began to understand that strength in this world was not measured in muscle or combat ability. It was measured in connections, in knowledge, in the ability to manipulate systems and people. These were skills he could learn. These were weapons he could master. His opportunity to prove this came in the form of a student named Elric Voss. Yes, the same nervous boy who had summoned him in the first place, whose failed experiment had ripped Kale from everything he knew and thrown him into this alien world. Elric had survived the incident, though barely. The magical backlash had left him with severe scarring, both physical and arcane, that limited his abilities. Where once he had shown promising potential in necromancy, he now struggled with even basic spells. His nervous condition had worsened, his trembling hands making precise magical work nearly impossible. He was a pariah among the students now, blamed for an accident that had damaged academy property, injured himself, and raised uncomfortable questions about security in the restricted sections. Most students avoided him, not wanting to be associated with someone so comprehensively failed. Some actively tormented him, seeing him as an easy target for their own frustrations and cruelties. No one wanted to be associated with the boy who had nearly torn a hole in reality. Kale approached him one evening in the library, careful to seem harmless and sympathetic. He took a seat across from Elric at a study table, offering a friendly smile that had taken weeks to perfect. He expressed interest in necromancy, asked questions about the accident with apparent innocent curiosity. Elric, desperate for any positive attention, opened up quickly. He talked about the summoning gone wrong, about the creature he believed he had glimpsed before losing consciousness. He described the terror of seeing something massive and wrong crashing into existence before his eyes. Kyle listened intently, his face betraying nothing. The boy had no idea that the monster he described was sitting across from him, wearing a student's robes and a gentle smile. Over the following months, Kyle cultivated this relationship with patient precision. He became Elric's friend, his confidant, his supporter against the bullies and doubters. When other students mocked Elric's trembling hands, Kale defended him. When professors dismissed Elric's potential, Kale argued for patience. When the darkness threatened to overwhelm Elric's fragile confidence, Kale was there with encouraging words and practical help. In return, Elric shared everything he knew about the Academy's secrets. The hidden passages that connected distant parts of the campus. The forbidden experiments that had been conducted in the basement levels. The dark history that the Council of 12 worked so hard to suppress. Scandals and cover-ups. Dangerous artifacts hidden in restricted vaults. Political alliances and ancient grudges. And most importantly, the weaknesses. The cracks in the Academy's seemingly perfect facade where a clever operator could find leverage. Every system has vulnerabilities. The Academy was no different. Kyle filed every piece of information away, building a map of opportunity in his mind. The grading system had subjective elements that could be manipulated. The examination process had gaps that could be exploited. The faculty had divisions that could be inflamed. The student body had resentments that could be channeled. Slowly, methodically, he began to see how the institution could be moved. Not through force, but through careful pressure applied at just the right points. His first move was small, almost unnoticeable. A minor noble whose family had crossed one of his underdog allies found his grades mysteriously dropping. There was no evidence of tampering. No witnesses to any wrongdoing. Just a gradual decline in performance that cost him his privileged standing and forced his family to reconsider their treatment of those they considered beneath them. Kyle watched the fallout with quiet satisfaction. He had spent months learning the grading systems, the examination procedures, the weak points where manipulation was possible. Now he was putting that knowledge to use. This was power in a world of magic. Not force, but influence. Not destruction, but control. the kind of power that could not be countered with spells or combated with enchantments, the kind of power that worked invisibly, leaving no trace for investigators to find. Other moves followed. A professor who had been particularly cruel to low-ranked students found his research plagiarized and published by a rival. The professor raged and accused, but could prove nothing. A prestigious club that excluded commoners suffered a series of embarrassing incidents that damaged its reputation and opened its membership to students who had previously been barred. Again, nothing could be traced to any specific actor. Nothing could be connected to Kale. Nothing could even be suspected of quiet Kalen Vert, the mediocre student from a dead family, struggling like everyone else to survive. He attended his classes. He turned in his assignments. He participated in the required social functions. He was utterly unremarkable in every way that mattered. But behind the mask, the Barbarian was hunting, and his prey was the entire system that had tried to exclude him. The years accumulated. 1 year became 2, became 3, became 4. Kale's network of underdogs and outcasts grew from a small circle of friends into a significant force within the academy. They helped each other with assignments. They shared information about opportunities. They watched each other's backs against the predations of the privileged, and they all looked to Kalen Vert as their unofficial leader, though he was always careful to deflect credit and maintain his appearance of humble mediocrity. His influence extended beyond the student body. He had cultivated relationships with certain professors, particularly those frustrated by the academy's rigid hierarchy, those who felt their talents were overlooked or their research underfunded. A word of sympathy here, a helpful suggestion there. Gradually, these professors began to see Kalen Vert as an unusually perceptive student, one worth cultivating for their own purposes. He had connections to staff members who felt overlooked and undervalued, the servants and maintenance workers and administrative assistants who kept the academy running while receiving little credit or compensation. These invisible workers knew secrets that the mages never bothered to notice. They knew which rooms were rarely checked, which schedules had gaps, which systems had weaknesses, and they were happy to share with the polite young student who actually treated them like human beings. He even had contacts among the magical merchants and fixers in the city below the academy, people who operated in the gray areas of magical law, who valued discretion and capability over pedigree. These connections provided resources that could not be obtained through official channels: information, materials, services, the infrastructure of an underground economy that existed in the shadows of the legitimate magical world. The Council of 12 remained beyond his reach, protected by centuries of tradition and magical safeguards. These ancient mages had seen every kind of manipulation, every form of political maneuvering, every attempt to subvert their authority. They were not easily fooled or influenced, but everyone around them was fair game. Kale had learned that you did not need to control the top to control a system. You just needed to control enough of the middle. Decisions flowed upward through channels he influenced. Information passed through networks he monitored. The council made choices based on reports that had been subtly shaped by his hidden hand. They adjusted policies in response to problems that he had quietly created. They rewarded students and professors who had been positioned for recognition by his machinations. They had no idea they were being manipulated by a creature that should not exist in their world. The turning point came in his 4th year, when a crisis threatened to expose everything. A visiting professor from a foreign academy brought specialized detection equipment capable of identifying non-human entities. The device was a breakthrough in magical security, designed to protect against shapeshifters, possessing spirits, and demonic infiltrators. The kind of infiltrators exactly like Kale. The academy conducted a mandatory screening of all students and staff, searching for spies and infiltrators. The announcement came during a routine assembly, delivered by one of the council members in tones of reassurance. Just a precaution, nothing to worry about. Everyone will be cleared and we can continue with confidence that our community is secure. Kyle watched the announcement with cold calculation. He had weeks to prepare, but no guarantee that his transformation would fool advanced detection magic. The surgery had changed his appearance, but his fundamental nature remained that of an underworld demon. If the device was sophisticated enough to detect the demonic energy that still flowed through his altered veins, he would be exposed instantly. The risk was enormous. If he was discovered, he would be killed or worse. All the years of careful preparation, of painful transformation, of slow building of influence would count for nothing. He would die as a monster in an examination chamber, and no one would ever know what he had accomplished. He spent those weeks in frantic preparation, layering additional magical disguises over his already altered form. He sought out obscure texts on concealment and misdirection, reading through the night in forgotten corners of the library. He even risked contacting certain underground elements in the city beyond the academy, trading favors for specialized artifacts that might help hide his nature. One such artifact was a ring that allegedly masked demonic resonance, worn by a merchant who had dealings with underworld traders. Another was a pendant that projected false magical signatures, confusing detection spells with contradictory information. A third was a potion that temporarily suppressed the unique energy patterns of demonic physiology. He acquired all of them, wearing or consuming each as the day of screening approached. When that day came, Kyle walked into the examination chamber with his heart pounding. For the first time since arriving in this world, the detection equipment filled the center of the room, a complex array of crystals and enchanted metals that hummed with investigative power. Students passed through its field one by one, each one briefly surrounded by the device's scanning glow, before being cleared and sent on their way. Kale stepped forward when his name was called. Every muscle tensed for combat if things went wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something other than walk calmly into what might be his execution. But he kept moving, kept the facade of nervous student firmly in place, entered the scanning field. The machine flickered. Its operator frowned, adjusting settings and rechecking readings. The glow around Kyle pulsed in ways it had not pulsed for other students. Someone in the observation area made a note. The operator called for a colleague to review the results. Kyle held his breath. His hands wanted to form fists. His legs wanted to run. His entire being wanted to revert to the simple violence that had always saved him before. But he stood still, waited, trusted in the preparations he had made. The colleague examined the readings, compared them to baseline data, ran additional calculations. Then she shrugged. Equipment malfunction, environmental interference, too much magical activity in the academy disrupting the calibration. They noted the anomaly and waved him through. The light turned green. Kyle was officially human in the eyes of their most advanced technology. He walked out of that chamber with a new confidence. Whatever combination of surgery, artifacts, and luck had saved him, it had been enough. If he could fool their machines, he could fool anything. The academy was truly his for the taking now. It was just a matter of time and continued patience. By his 6th year, Kyle had built a quiet empire within the academy's shadows. His network had grown from a handful of underdogs to a web of connections that touched every part of the institution. Students who owed him favors, professors who valued his insights, staff members who trusted his discretion, external contacts who provided resources and information. All of them working for their own purposes, unaware that they were pieces in a larger game. He graduated with honors that year, not as the top of his class, but high enough to earn attention without drawing suspicion. The Council of 12 invited him to join the Academy's administrative staff, recognizing his organizational abilities and his seemingly infinite capacity for solving problems. He accepted with appropriate humility, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to serve the institution that had given him so much. In truth, he was accepting the next stage of his conquest. The years that followed were a slow but steady ascent through the ranks of power. Kalen Vert rose through the administrative hierarchy with quiet efficiency. He solved problems before they became crises, demonstrating an uncanny ability to predict where difficulties would arise. He mediated disputes with apparent fairness, earning the trust of all parties even as he maneuvered them to positions that served his interests. He made allies of everyone who could be useful and neutralized enemies through methods they never saw coming. By his 10th year in administration, he sat on the advisory council that shaped academy policy. By his 15th, he had become the youngest vice-chancellor in the academy's history, responsible for the day-to-day operations that kept the institution running. The Council of 12 relied on his reports, his recommendations, his implementation of their decisions. They saw him as an indispensable servant of the academy. They had no idea he was the one truly in control. Throughout this rise, he never forgot what he was. In private moments, he would descend to the sewers where his journey began, sitting in the darkness and remembering. The underworld, the summoning, the desperate surgery that had remade him, the years of hiding and learning and scheming. He had come so far from that terrified creature who had crashed into existence in a failed necromancer's circle. And yet, he knew he was still the same. Still a predator. Still a survivor. Just wearing a different skin. Just using different weapons. The violence of the underworld had been replaced by the manipulation of systems. The physical strength of the Ravager had been replaced by the institutional power of the Administrator. But the fundamental drive remained unchanged. Survive. Dominate. Win. The final phase of his plan began in the spring of his 20th year at the Academy. He was Vice-Chancellor now, positioned just below the Council of 12 in the official hierarchy, just above them in actual influence. The Academy was preparing for a major event, the quincentennial celebration of its founding, 500 years of magical excellence that would bring dignitaries and alumni from across the realm. Security would be tight, but attention would be divided. The council would be occupied with ceremonial duties. The faculty would be absorbed in showcasing their research. The students would be distracted by festivities. It was the perfect moment to make his move. But this move would not be violent. Kale had learned enough about this world to understand that brute force was the tool of last resort. True power came from making yourself indispensable, from solving problems that no one else could solve, from being the person everyone needed but no one suspected. The crisis he engineered was subtle but devastating. A magical plague began spreading through the academy's lower levels, affecting students and staff who worked in the older sections of the campus. Not deadly, but debilitating. Those afflicted suffered weakness, confusion, magical instability that made spellcasting dangerous or impossible. Classes were cancelled. Research was suspended. The quincentennial preparations ground to a halt as the Academy scrambled to contain the threat. The Council of 12 threw their considerable power at the problem, but the plague seemed to resist all conventional treatments. Their best healers were baffled by symptoms that changed unpredictably. Their most powerful mages found their spells sliding off the affliction as if it were made of something fundamentally incompatible with their magic. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. And into this chaos stepped Vice-Chancellor Kalen Vert with a cure. He had developed it months ago, working in secret, with alchemical compounds he had discovered in the deepest parts of the Academy's archives. The plague itself was his creation, designed using his knowledge of both worlds, incorporating elements of underworld pathology that human magic could not address. It was resistant to normal treatments but vulnerable to a specific combination of necromantic techniques that only he possessed. It was elegant, really. Create a problem no one else could solve. Then solve it. The cure worked exactly as intended. Within days of its distribution, the plague was eradicated. Students recovered. Research resumed. The quincentennial celebration proceeded on schedule. and Kalen Vert became a hero, celebrated by students and faculty alike as the savior of the academy in its darkest hour. The Council of 12 summoned him for a personal audience. The ancient mages gathered in their high chamber to acknowledge the man who had saved their institution. They offered praise with words that had rarely been spoken to anyone outside their circle. They offered rewards that were usually reserved for only the most exceptional service, and they offered a position that had never been offered to anyone of his relative youth. Chancellor of Celestine Academy, the highest position in the institution, a seat among the Council of 12, access to power that would make him one of the most influential figures in the realm. Kyle accepted with appropriate humility, thanking them for their faith, promising to serve the academy with all his ability. They saw what he wanted them to see: a dedicated administrator who had risen through merit, a loyal servant who would continue their traditions, someone worthy of their trust. They did not see the barbarian who had hidden among them for 2 decades. They did not see the demon who had transformed himself through surgery and will. They did not see the predator who had played the longest game imaginable. As he walked out of that chamber, officially recognized as the leader of humanity's greatest magical institution, Kale allowed himself a rare smile. The transformation was complete. Not just of his body, but of his entire existence. He was no longer Kale Thornvane, ravager of the Underworld. He was Chancellor Kalen Vert of Celestine Academy, a respected leader, a trusted administrator, a hero who had saved his institution in its hour of need. And somewhere beneath the academy, in the sewers where his journey began, the rats still scurried through the darkness, unaware that the greatest predator they had ever known now ruled the world above. The years that followed his appointment as chancellor were marked by reforms that none had anticipated. Kale, operating as Kalen Vert, did not simply maintain the academy as it had always been. He began to change it, slowly and methodically, in ways that reflected his unique perspective on power and survival. The rigid hierarchy that had once dominated student life was loosened, creating pathways for talented individuals regardless of their birth. The harsh treatment of low-ranked students was curtailed through policy changes that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had never been implemented before. Some wondered why a man who had risen through traditional channels would dismantle the very system that had elevated him. The Council of 12 debated among themselves, trying to understand their new colleagues' motivations. Some suspected he was building a power base among the grateful lower classes. Others thought he was genuinely idealistic. None guessed the truth, that he was creating a world where creatures like his former self might actually have a chance. Not out of altruism, but out of a cold calculation that such a world would be more stable, more productive, and ultimately more useful to whoever controlled it. He maintained his network of connections, though now they operated openly as the Chancellor's allies, rather than as shadows in the margins. The underdogs he had gathered during his student years rose with him, filling positions of influence throughout the academy and beyond. Mira, the farmer's daughter, who had struggled with magical theory, became the head of practical applications. Tam, the scholarship boy who had faced constant discrimination, led the reformed admissions committee. Sarah, whose secret burden had been a prophetic gift she could not control, now directed the divination faculty with support and resources she had never imagined. Even Elric Voss found a place in the new order. The nervous boy who had accidentally summoned a demon from the underworld had grown into a cautious man. His confidence slowly rebuilt through years of friendship with the one who should have been his greatest enemy. Kale had never revealed his true nature to Elric. Perhaps he never would. But he ensured that Elric received the resources and support to continue his research, even as his damaged abilities limited what he could accomplish personally. The irony was not lost on Kyle. The summoning that had ripped him from everything he knew had also given him everything he now possessed. If Elric's experiment had worked correctly, Kale would still be in the underworld, crushing skulls and serving demon princes, he would have lived and died as a ravager, never knowing that another kind of existence was possible. The failure of that spell had been the greatest gift he had ever received, even if the giving had been unintentional, and the price had been almost unbearable. Sometimes, late at night, when the academy was quiet, and the moons rose over the distant mountains, Kale would remove the magical disguises that still maintained his false appearance, and look at his true reflection. The face that stared back was neither the monster he had been, nor the man he pretended to be. His eyes had returned to their natural crimson over the years, the tincture that had suppressed them no longer necessary in his private chambers. His body, though still reduced from its former glory, had regained some of its density, muscle memory and demonic physiology slowly rebuilding what surgery had removed. He was something new, something that had not existed before and would never exist again. A creature forged in the collision of two worlds, shaped by sacrifice and determination, defined by an absolute refusal to be destroyed. He was the Chancellor of Celestine Academy. He was the hidden ruler of the realm's greatest magical institution. He was the silent architect of reforms that would change magical society for generations. And he was, when you stripped away all the titles and pretenses, still just a survivor. The last barbarian of the Underworld, hiding in plain sight, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. There were moments when he considered revealing himself, when he wondered what would happen if he showed the council the truth of what he was, demonstrated that a demon could lead with wisdom rather than destruction. But he always dismissed these thoughts. The risk was too great, the prejudice too deep. Even after everything he had accomplished, he knew that revelation would mean death or imprisonment. The magical world was not ready to accept that their greatest leader was the very thing they had been taught to fear and destroy. So he kept his secret, carrying it like a weight that never lightened. The loneliness of it was profound, an isolation that no amount of power could cure. He had allies, subordinates, colleagues, admirers. He had people who would die for Chancellor Kalen Vert without hesitation. But none of them knew who he really was. None of them could truly understand the journey he had taken, the price he had paid, the creature that lurked behind the human mask. Perhaps that was the final cost of survival. Not the loss of strength, not the pain of transformation, not the decades of patient scheming, but the knowledge that he could never truly be known. That the connection he had observed between humans, the deep understanding that came from shared identity and honest revelation, was forever beyond his reach. He had escaped the Underworld. He had conquered the Academy. He had risen to heights that would have seemed impossible to the terrified creature who had hidden in the sewers all those years ago. But he was still, in the end, utterly alone. The Academy continued its work of training mages and advancing magical knowledge, its new chancellor guiding it with a steady hand. The quincentennial celebration came and went, replaced by the normal cycles of academic life. Seasons turned, students graduated, new students arrived, the great wheel of education turned on, and at its center sat a being who should not exist, orchestrating it all with patience that had been tested in the fires of two worlds. And if sometimes the Chancellor of Celestine Academy paused at a window overlooking the city below, his crimson eyes briefly visible in the reflection of the glass, well, no one was, watching closely enough to notice. No one ever had been. That, perhaps, was the greatest lesson the Underworld Barbarian had learned in his long journey through the world of mages. The most powerful hiding place was not the sewers beneath the Academy. It was the assumptions that people made about the world around them. They assumed that monsters could not learn patience, that demons could not master subtlety, that brute strength was incompatible with intellectual achievement. They assumed that the categories they had created to understand the world were accurate and complete. And in those assumptions, in the gaps between what they believed possible and what actually was, Kyle had found his empire. So what did you think of this story? A barbarian who gave up everything that made him powerful just to survive in a world that would have destroyed him. A creature of violence who learned that the greatest conquest requires no blood at all. A monster who became more human than the humans who would have hunted him down. If you enjoyed this journey through darkness and transformation, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Kyle's position. Would you have given up your strength to blend in? Would you have tried to fight your way through? Or would you have found some other path entirely? I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious, stay hungry, and never forget that sometimes the greatest power is knowing when to change.